Regarding the Iran-Contra matter, we seem to be in the eye of the hurricane. Both houses of Congress have selected committees investigating the when, where, and who of the incidents, and the shadow of the legal proceedings by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh looms over the entire cast of characters. I'm sure that any of us that have turned on the television this morning will agree with that. Against the background, we welcome Daniel Sheehan, General Counsel and Public Policy Director of the Christic Institute. The Christic Institute commits its resources to cases it has selected for their potential to reverse what the Institute considers to be a steady erosion of both personal freedom and social justice in the United States. Among the controversial decisions which the Institute prosecuted are the victory in the Karen Silkwood case, the verdict against the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party for the murder of anti-Klan demonstrators, and a dismissal of all charges against Stacey Mert, the first sanctuary movement defense case. Daniel Sheehan has spent more than 3 years investigating criminal activity by American citizens in support of the Contras, and has testified before a House subcommittee investigating the private war being waged by Americans on behalf of the Contras. In addition to taking the central role in the litigations mentioned above, Mr. Sheehan was also an attorney for the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, was involved in the trials at Wounded Knee, and participated in the civil rights suit following the tragedy at Attica Prison in New York. He's a graduate of Harvard University Law School, where he participated in founding the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. We look forward to hearing his informed comments today. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Sheehan.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for lunch today. I want to thank General Secord for his timely introduction to our topic today. I've just returned yesterday evening from Costa Rica, where we have been conducting the federal depositions in the federal racketeering prosecution, which the Christic Institute is prosecuting against some 29 men in Miami in the federal court. This case, of course, is the case of Tony Avergon, the ABC television cameraman who was seriously wounded in a terrorist bombing attack on a press conference on Memorial Day of 1984. We have been taking the depositions in Costa Rica last week and will continue after this speech here today when I return to Costa Rica. We've been taking the depositions of the Attorney General of Costa Rica, the former Director of Internal Security in Costa Rica, and Eden Pastora, the dissident Nicaraguan military leader who ran a group called ARDE, a anti-Sandinista front organization in Costa Rica. We have been developing the evidence now for some 3 years of the existence of this secret network, which has become dramatically more public since our filing of the federal racketeering charges against them 1 year ago this month. As we come here today to speak with you, as I said, Major General Secord is testifying at this moment in the United States Congress over live television. On Sunday, you may have seen on the front page of the New York Times, former Costa Rican Ambassador Louis Tams has finally acknowledged that he was directly involved in supporting the Contra forces out of Costa Rica under the direction of a group called the Restricted Interagency Group, which was made up of not only Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, but CIA Latin American Director Alan Farr and Elliot Abrams, the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs. What I come here today to do is to, in the brief time that we have together, to first communicate to you what the real facts are underlying this major tragedy in our national history. Secondly, to discuss with you the important legal, constitutional, and public policy implications of what the true facts will reveal. And thirdly, to warn against the type of defensive, limited types of inquiries that are being made in Washington by both the special prosecutor's staff and the United States Congress. The efforts of the special prosecutor to characterize the nature of the conspiracy as one that was simply involved in fraud, such as with Spitz Channel, simply gathering money under tax deduction laws to give to the military support of the Contras, and to suggest that perhaps the nature of the criminality of those involved in the entire Iran-Contra operation was also simply fraud, since they were defrauding the American people of the value of their salary while they were engaged in what was essentially a private project. And finally, to warn you against the tone that's being taken by the Congress, where they are attempting in their questioning of Mr. Secord, for example, to attribute the motive to these men as personal greed, that somehow they were having the money stick to their fingers or sliding it into their own bank accounts. The simple fact is that they're attempting to lay the weight of this either on these men individually or, at most, to blame a single administration of our government for the wrongdoing so that they can limit the damage in this scandal to that which is analogous to what occurred in Watergate. What I want to talk with you about is the fact that this crisis and the facts that will be revealed by our private investigation and civil prosecution are dramatically more serious than those that were revealed in Watergate. And I want to demonstrate that the Christic Institute is once again engaged in the revelation of information which the American people and the American political leadership simply do not want exposed. We have done this in the past in the Karen Silkwood case, when we developed the information and showed that the type of recklessness and lack of safety standards that obtain in our private nuclear industry are so serious that they require some major radical attention. We also, as was pointed out by Victor in the introduction, undertook the federal investigation and civil prosecution of the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi Party for gunning down demonstrators on the main streets of North Carolina and going away unscathed by the justice system. What we want to do is point out quickly to you how we became involved in this and what the facts are. We were contacted at the Christic Institute back in March of 1984, over 3 years ago now, by the Catholic Bishop's Office in Brownsville, Texas, Bishop John Fitzpatrick. Their staff asked us to come there to participate in the criminal defense of Sister Diane Mellencamp, Stacy Merck, and a Dallas Times Herald newspaper reporter named Jack Fisher, who had been arrested attempting to transport people from Central America up to San Antonio, where they could apply for political asylum under the Refugee Act of 1980. Because it was established in that trial, the Reagan administration, who disagreed with the content of the Refugee Act of 1980, the provisions which allowed people to come to our country and to apply for political asylum if they held a well-founded fear of being persecuted by their governments in Central America, that since the Reagan administration disagreed with the thrust of that law, that they were in fact simply defying it. And they were refusing to accept any applications for political asylum in the entire Harlingen district. Once again, the Christic Institute moved to attempt to demonstrate to the American people the failure of certain government officials to live up to the responsibilities to which they had been called. During this investigation, however, we began getting information that certain FBI field agents had approached members of the religious community in the Texas area and warned them against participation with the sanctuary movement and with the church people involved in it, because the FBI had information indicating to them that the sanctuary movement was being used merely as a front for smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States, that these people were going to organize themselves into military cadres to launch direct military assaults on U.S. military bases and communication centers if the President of the United States found it necessary to undertake direct military action in Central America. As we pursued the sources of these rather bizarre accusations, we uncovered the existence of a Federal Emergency Management Agency plan to engage in a readiness exercise, a nationwide readiness exercise in the spring of 1984, which was characterized by the code name Rex 84. Pursuant to that plan, they would undertake a scenario by means of which, in the event that the President found it necessary to undertake direct military action in Central America, either in El Salvador or in Nicaragua, that the Federal Emergency Management Agency would mobilize the state National Guard units and others to round up some 400,000 undocumented Central American aliens and place them in 10 military detention camps in this state of emergency. There was a second portion of the plan, however, that became more pertinent to the reason we're gathered here today. The second portion of the plan, under Rex 84, was to test the feasibility of moving large amounts of military equipment during this readiness exercise that would be hypothetically undertaken in the event that the President had to move into Central America with military troops. This second portion of the readiness exercise had to do with moving from the Defense Department through the State National Guard units down to groups that would be established called State Defense Forces, large amounts of military equipment. But once the military equipment was placed into the hands of these volunteers, these auxiliaries, the military equipment was going to be revalued while out in the field. And at the end of the readiness exercise, the same dollar amount of equipment that had been distributed originally would be collected. Let me clarify. At the beginning of the exercise, hypothetically, some $25 million worth of military equipment would be distributed to these auxiliary law enforcement officers. But while it was in their hands, it would be revalued from the manufacturer value to the much higher replacement value. And then at the end of the readiness exercise, $25 million worth of military equipment would be gathered up, leaving a significant amount of military equipment out in the hands of these people. The people who were being signed up to participate in these groups called State Defense Forces were soldiers of fortune, men who had received word of this program at the weekend war game training camps of the survivalist movement. And we learned that this was part of a plan to smuggle this military equipment covertly to the Contras, because the Boland Amendment had been passed by the United States Congress in March of 1984, prohibiting the White House or any of the federal agencies involved in intelligence gathering activities from providing any assistance whatsoever to the Contras, either direct or indirect. So what we had uncovered at the Christic Institute was a covert program to violate the restrictions of the United States Congress with regard to support of the Contras. As we pursued this information, we discovered that this military equipment was going to be taken from Louisiana and Alabama and Texas and moved in part through the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport in Miami, down to Ilopango, a jointly administered U.S. Salvadorian base, and then into a large ranch in Costa Rica, owned by a millionaire American rancher by the name of John Hull. From there, this explosives, ammunition, and other military equipment would be distributed to the Contras. Because of our peculiar authority at the Christic Institute under the Internal Revenue statutes, we are authorized to what they call foment litigation. That means we're able to go out and attempt to find plaintiffs who can have standing to bring litigation to solve certain important public policy problems. We thereupon began to pursue potential plaintiffs in such a case who might have standing to bring a complaint against that activity. It was then, in May of 1984, that a terrible tragedy occurred inside Nicaragua. The dissident Nicaraguan military leader, Eden Pastora, Comandante Zero, called a major press conference at a small jungle retreat in Nicaragua by the name of La Penca. At this press conference, he was going to denounce the American Central Intelligence Agency and the FDN, the major Contra organization operating out of Honduras with CIA support, for attempting to crush the genuine dissident movement of people from Nicaragua who were attempting to establish a more moderate opposition to the Nicaraguan Sandinista government. He called the press conference, appeared at the press conference, and at the press conference, a man who used the name Per Anker Hansen, posing as a Danish journalist, came to the press conference, and on the videotapes, which the Christic Institute has, that were taken by the reporters at this press conference, you can see this man, Per Anker Hansen, move through the front of this room, this small jungle hut where the press conference was being held. And on videotape, you can see him, Per Anker Hansen, move to the front of the room and set a large aluminum camera case down at the foot of the table from which Comandante Zero was speaking. And then as the rest of the press, international press community of the world surged to the front of the room to begin the press conference, you could see Per Anker Hansen on the videotape skulking to the side of the room and escaping through a door in the back. Moments later, a huge explosion erupted, killing several of the international journalist community, killing some number of supporters of Eden Pastora, and seriously mutilating some 24 other people at the press conference. One of these men was a young ABC television cameraman by the name of Tony Avergan. Tony Avergan's wife, Martha Honey, who was a BBC correspondent from Costa Rica and also a correspondent to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, came to the United States with him for hospitalization and sought out the assistance of the American, I'm forgetting their name, the group of the American Journalists Society to protect them against these attacks and to find out who had perpetrated this attack. They gave some minor funding to begin this investigation. That investigation began to develop evidence that showed that the people who had carried out this terrorist bombing attack were attempting to silence Eden Pastora as a dissident voice within the Contra movement, a voice for more moderate opposition to the Nicaraguan government. It also demonstrated, this investigation, that those who had carried out the terrorist bombing attack had launched the attack and been supplied off the ranch of a millionaire American rancher by the name of John Hull. They published this information and were immediately sued by John Hull, charged with criminal libel in the courts of Costa Rica. The Christic Institute was then contacted by Tony Avergan and Martha Honey and asked to defend them on the grounds that we had developed some of this evidence to show where this military equipment was coming from. We moved in, and in May of last year, prepared the criminal defense for Tony Avergan and Martha Honey and defeated John Hull, demonstrating to the satisfaction of the court that the charges that had been made against John Hull and these other terrorists were in fact totally justified. We at that time at the Christic Institute decided, along with Martha Honey and Tony Avergan, that we would bring a federal suit in the United States charging those individuals who had participated in this terrorist assault on the press conference with charges of civil tort or civil remedy for the assault. But as we began to investigate, we discovered that the financing for the military equipment and explosives that had been used from John Hull's ranch in this terrorist attack had been financed by major cocaine smuggling operations. Since the United States Congress had cut off support to the Contras, they had undertaken to establish an alliance with the dreaded Medellin cartel of the cocaine empire in Colombia, and that they began smuggling tons of cocaine from Colombia with the assistance of Jorge Ochoa and Pablo Escobar from the cartel into the ranch of John Hull. And when the military planes would come onto John Hull's ranch from this secret arms network and land on his ranch, they would unload the weapons and load the cocaine onto the same airplanes and would fly them back up into the United States under the cover that they were given to smuggle the weapons, and were distributing tons of cocaine to our children and to our high school students across our country in order to fund their military conflict. Because of the information developing, we learned that there was a special federal statute called the Federal Racketeering Act, or the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organization Act. And we proceeded to develop a prosecution against this group of people that carried out the terrorist bombing, which authorized us under the act not only to prosecute the individuals who had been responsible for the terrorist bombing attack, but also under the racketeering statute to prosecute the more general enterprise of which they had been a part, And we were therefore given the authority by the federal court to prosecute the entire network, the private network that had been mounting this criminal war against the government of Nicaragua in violation of the Federal Neutrality Act. And it was at that time that we discovered the facts which we think it's essential to communicate to you now. And that are these, in the brief time that we have. We discovered that the private network that was supporting John Hall and supplying the military equipment was made up of very high-ranking United States military officials that had resigned from our government and members of the Central Intelligence Agency. Major General Richard Secord, who had been the head of the Foreign Military Sales Program for the United States in the Middle East, in Iran. Also Tom Kleins, who had been the assistant to a man by the name of Theodore Shackley. And Theodore Shackley was involved in this arms supply. And that Theodore Shackley had been the former director of all covert activities for the Central Intelligence Agency worldwide under George Bush, when George Bush had been the director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976. We also learned that working with them was a man by the name of Albert Hakim, a man by the name of Rafael Chichi Quintero, a man by the name of Felix Rodriguez, and a man by the name of Jose Posada Correa, who you know as Ramon Medina. We uncovered this entire network of people, and we joined them in the federal prosecution, along with John Hall and the actual terrorists, Per Anker Hansen and the others who'd carried out the bombing. And after preparing the case for filing, one of the courts in the 11th Circuit, where Florida rests, entered an additional requirement of the RICO prosecution and said that in addition to showing the overt act that injured your plaintiffs and showing the general enterprise of which it was a part, in order to sustain a federal prosecution under RICO, you have to show also a previous pattern of racketeering on the part of those same people. But rather than deterring this merely sent us into a deeper exploration, which revealed that this same network of men who were providing the military equipment to the Contras had in fact been supplying the original military equipment to the dictator Anastasio Somoza for Nicaragua after he'd been cut off by the official policy of our government. And when we explored to find out where these men had come from, we learned that these were the men that had been fired and pushed out of the Central Intelligence Agency under the Carter administration. Under the Carter administration, they placed a much higher value on human rights and tried to stop the black operations of the operational directorate of the CIA. Indeed, the scandal that had triggered that major operation was the revelation that, in fact, a man by the name of Ed Wilson had been engaged in Iran in selling C4 and military explosives to Libya while he was supposed to be working with the Central Intelligence Agency. As it turned out, all of these men, Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, and Edwin Wilson and these men had been partners in a private corporation in the Middle East known as the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company. It is the company that was given the contract to deliver the military equipment to Egypt under the Camp David Accords. That this was a secret corporation that had been set up by these private individuals after they had been forced out of the CIA, and that they had, in defiance of American policy and in support of their ultra-right-wing political views, had determined that they were going to supply military equipment to the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, even after our Congress and our people had made a factual finding that he was systematically engaged in the violation of the human rights of his own citizens, and that he had been cut off from military support under our laws. When we pursued that further, we discovered that before being forced out of the government, Theodore Shackley and Tom Kleins and Richard Secord and the others had been participating in Iran from 1976 to 1979 in a major criminal conspiracy to carry out political assassinations without the authorization of President Carter or the director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner. That these men had taken it upon themselves to pursue a murderous covert course against people that they viewed to be threats to the political objectives of the American government in Iran. Now, it's important to note that these people were pursuing an ideological course. They were pursuing a course of carrying out political assassinations against persons whom they genuinely believed to be inimical to the political and economic objectives of our country. But they were doing it without the authorization of the president or the director of the CIA after they'd been terminated from that employment. The reason that they felt justified in doing so, as it turns out, is because under the prior administrations, they had been authorized to pursue such conduct. And it turns out that the secret source of funding that was being used to fund this political assassination program was a covert smuggling program from Southeast Asia in which they smuggled tons of heroin and opium from Southeast Asia during the South Vietnamese conflict and put the money secretly into a bank in Australia by the name of Nguyen Hand. And that these funds were used as a covert black source of funding for carrying out this ultimately nefarious program of these ultra-right-wing elements within our Central Intelligence Agency and our top military. And in addition to that source of funding, they were carrying out a major program of embezzlement of money from the Foreign Military Sales Program, which was supervised by Major General Richard Secord in Iran. This is not new, what he is doing here. This obtaining of military equipment from the United States Pentagon at cost and then selling it to foreign countries at its marked up value of replacement value, and then giving only the money for the manufacturer cost to our government and moving the excess money into secret bank accounts has been going on now for over a decade. And that it has been supervised by Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, and the field officer for the distribution of this equipment and the carrying out of these political assassinations is a man by the name of Rafael Chichi Quintero, the same man who supervised the construction of the airstrip in Costa Rica, the same man who delivered the $2 million ransom to attempt to ransom out of Iranian custody James Buckley. And interestingly enough, it turns out, according to evidence that we have, that the man who had to check off on these political assassinations was James Buckley himself, the man who was kidnapped in Beirut and later taken to Tehran, where he was tortured. And it was in fact because of this man's capture that the original negotiations began with the Iranian government, not to give them weapons in exchange for our hostages. Those other hostages have been in custody for many, many months, and nothing was being done by our administration to get them out. But it was when this man, James Buckley, was taken into custody and began to be tortured, is when Ghubbanifar reached out on behalf of the Iranian torturers and established contact with Theodore Shackley, not with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, not with Vice President Bush, but with Theodore Shackley, the man who had in fact supervised the anti-terrorist assassination program covertly operated for many years. Now, this is the beginning of an operation which becomes extraordinarily serious, because what we see going on in Washington is a concentrated attempt not to go back into the past beyond October of 1984 with the passage of the Boland Amendment. They do not want to understand who these people are. For example, on the Nightline show on ABC, when Barbara Walters and Ted Koppel were interviewing Ghubbanifar some weeks ago, and they said to him, "Mr. Ghubbanifar, there have been numerous rumors as to whose idea this was to trade these weapons for the hostages. Some people say it was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's idea. Others blame it on the foreign minister of Israel. Whose idea was that?" And he said, "Oh, it was Ted Shackley's idea." At which point they all looked at the other and said, "Who the hell is Ted Shackley?" You see, they didn't know what they were doing, and they still don't. But now they do know. We know they know because we've told them. We've met with Art Lyman, the chief counsel for the Senate Select Committee, and have explained in detail to him, have offered witnesses to him, documented proof to him. We have met with the investigative staff of the Special Prosecutor's Office and have conveyed the information to them. And what they have said to us is, we are not responsible for eradicating the past sins of the CIA. And they have said that they have a very narrow jurisdiction, and they are only looking into this question of whether or not the president knew about the diversion of part of the profits from one or two sales of weapons to Iran to the Contras. Now, this is an extraordinarily narrow view of the crisis that we're facing here today, because what we have discovered that in addition to being funded by heroin smuggling from Southeast Asia, these exact men, Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Richard Secord, and these men, Rafael Chichi Quintero, are the ones who established and prosecuted the massive assassination of non-combatant civilians in Southeast Asia under the now dreaded Phoenix Project. These are the people who funded their operation with the heroin funds from Vang Pao, and that these were established as early as 1965 when Theodore Shackley was the deputy director for the Central Intelligence Agency in Laos. And who was the man who ran the military operation covertly in Laos at that time that supervised these assassinations? Major General John K. Singlaub, who was the man who was brought in by Oliver North to raise the funds around the country, who has been here talking to you about how essential it is to maintain this type of steadfast position against the communist threat in this world. In fact, John K. Singlaub was the CIA station chief in Burma in 1949 when Mao Zedong drove out the major heroin producers from the Shan provinces of China. And where did they go? They went into Burma. They went into Burma and they set up their heroin manufacturing operations in southern Burma when John K. Singlaub was the director of the CIA in that country. And this source of funding, the heroin and opium funding, has been the major source of funding for the nationalist Chinese Kuomintang. The chief of intelligence for the Kuomintang, who John K. Singlaub worked with so arduously, was a man by the name of General Tai Li. He was in fact the director of the Green Gang, who were the major opium and heroin producers in the world. This type of tragedy that has befallen our national security infrastructure is one that must be dealt with. That this insistence upon covert actions without the authority of our Congress, without the authority of our people, indeed in direct defiance of our presidents, must be stopped. It is more serious, vastly more serious than is being suggested. So I would like to point out that there are some 6 major public policy problems that are not being addressed by these inquiries. First is this major question of not a National Security Council that may have suffered from a lack of management style, not some individuals who may have been overzealous in carrying out their understood missions. What we're dealing with is either a national security bureaucracy that is ultimately out of control, driven by its own ultra-right-wing ideology and unresponsive to the helm of our state leaders, or we're dealing with a secret ideological military arm of the president that has been carrying out covert assassinations and operations against people with whom they differ politically in the world. Whether we agree with such a secret national security state apparatus or not, it becomes essential that it be understood and that it be subject to proper supervision, which it is not at this time. A second major public policy issue which is not being addressed is the fact that there is evidence that some of this black money, this millions and millions of dollars of money from the drug traffic and embezzled foreign military sales programs, is being funneled back into the United States, into our democratic political processes. This Spitz Channel was responsible for moving millions of dollars from these black funds through South Africa into the PACs, which opposed those senatorial and congressional candidates who had voted against funding the Contras. Now, this is an extraordinary policy problem to have the national security state bureaucracy of our country undertaken to poison and to distort the actual selection of our own political representatives in this country and to crush those who oppose their clandestine operations is absolutely unacceptable in our country. And it must be stopped. There is also evidence that this went on in 1980, smuggling money in from the black funds through South Africa to attack some 6 major liberal senators. As you recall, this was Senator McGovern and Clark and Church and the others who had helped to supervise a major inquiry into the intelligence abuses of our intelligence community. A third major public policy problem, as I have mentioned, is this massive embezzlement of funds from the foreign military sales program for use in covert operations. A fourth area is the drug smuggling alliance, the utilization of cocaine funding and heroin and opium income to fund these black operations out of a fear that any other source of funding could be discovered by the American public in the Congress. A fifth area is the ultimate compromise that is being imposed upon our entire system of law. The turning of a blind eye and deaf ear to the gun running, to the drug smuggling, to the massive criminality compromises our justice system. Evidence will be developed that will demonstrate to you that Edwin Meese himself was intimately involved in authorizing these covert programs for the Contras in Iran, and that he, sitting at the head of the Justice Department, has given personal directives to the Southern Office of the Justice Department in Florida to avoid investigating this type of criminality, both the arms smuggling and the drug smuggling, for which, in fact, he will be impeached and he will be criminally indicted and sent to federal prison for obstruction of justice. You will also note that the compromises that have been made on our respect for law are those of the International Court, that our administration has withdrawn us from the International Court in the face of charges of mounting aggressive political wars in violation of the Nuremberg Accords against people. There is, I've pointed out, the violation of the INS laws by this administration. And finally, and very importantly, there is this ultimate program of political terrorism that is being waged covertly by the members of this secret team to hunt down and to politically assassinate foreign leaders and political leaders around the country and around the world who disagree with their political objectives. And just as recently as this morning, there is evidence developing now that they have discovered a plan on the part of these people to undertake the political assassination of Daniel Ortega as the head of the Sandinista government. Now, these efforts on the part of the Tower Commission and the Special Prosecutor in the United States Congress to distort what the issues are, it is because they are afraid, my friends. They are afraid that the American people cannot stand to know this information. They do not think that we are strong enough or have the political will to purge these terrible things from our past. These are the people who will attempt to convince us that this scandal is nothing more serious than a cancerous nodule on the nose of one president. Whereas, in fact, what we are facing here is a cancer deep in the chest of our body politic. And these are the men who will tell us that we cannot move to excise this cancer from our body politic. Let's merely pretend that we don't have this cancer, and perhaps it will go away. More importantly, let's talk about some cancer, this minor cancer on the nose of one president, so that at least we'll have addressed some of the issue. These are the people who don't believe that our body politic is strong enough to survive this operation. My friends, these are the same people who do not believe ultimately in the democratic principles for which this government stands from the beginning. These are the people who do not have confidence in us, to share information with us, to ask for our support. These are the people who insist upon going to the back alleys, to the midnight soldiers of the national security state bureaucracy, to carry out covert black deeds in our name. These are not the men who we should trust when they advise us that we are not strong enough to survive such an important operation. We are the people, us gathered here today and the others across our country, who have confidence in our structures, in our organs of government. We at the Christic Institute have brought this evidence to the FBI in personal meetings with Judge Webster. We have met with the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency's Chief Assistant. We have met with Justice Department people, with Customs people, with DEA people, to attempt to not defy our government, not to insult our government, but to insist that the organs of government and law enforcement work in our country. Because ultimately, these are our defense against communism. These are our defense against those who disagree with our political values. That's why we come here today, not as partisans, but as patriotic American citizens, to ask your support in defending our Constitution, defending our form of government, insisting that a full and thorough investigation of these charges be brought out, and that we ask your support in doing this in the federal court in Miami if it is not done by our elected leaders. We ask for your support. We ask for your prayers. Thank you very much.
What is the status of the case in the federal courts of Florida at this point?
The case brought under the federal racketeering statute, which is the same as the criminal statute. This is a federal criminal statute that has a small provision which allows citizens of our country to initiate lawsuits against criminal enterprises such as this under a theory what they call the private attorney general theory. The opposition, who had been represented, Adolfo Calero, the head of the FDN, they had been represented by a man by the name of Tony Lapham, the former chief counsel for the United States Central Intelligence Agency, have filed opposition to our being able to prosecute them under the racketeering statute, and Chief Federal Judge James Lawrence King has overruled all of their motions to dismiss. He has given the Christic Institute federal subpoena power to subpoena their bank records, phone records, and to take federal sworn depositions with the authority of our federal government going back all the way to 1959. These depositions have begun. We have deposed a number of pilots in Miami, whose names we then turned over to the media, and they were interviewed. You may have seen them on West 57th Street on CBS 2 weeks ago Monday. We have developed this information. We are now in the process of our second round of depositions in Costa Rica to obtain the detailed information about the bombing and the terrorist network there in Central America. These depositions will go on for approximately 1 year. We will prosecute these people in federal court in the spring, around Easter of 1988, seeking to obtain civil convictions of these men so that we can turn this information over to the Justice Department, demonstrating that we have proved by a preponderance of the evidence the truthfulness of these accusations, and insist that they be presented to a federal grand jury for criminal prosecution by the Attorney General under the new administration in 1989.
Sheehan, just a few weeks ago when President Reagan spoke with the council, just before we introduced him, we introduced Chief of Staff Howard Baker, and although the press didn't pick it up at the time, it seemed to me that he got the biggest ovation other than the President himself before that very large audience. I'm wondering, since he's been in office in the White House, has he been able to do much to clear out the zealots that have been causing some of these problems you talked about?
It's going to be very difficult in light of the fact that I'll give you some information to give you some idea how difficult it will be. In 1978, when it was discovered that Ed Wilson was carrying out this criminal operation of selling C4 and explosives to the Libyan government, he was indicted by Larry Barcella, an assistant United States attorney. He and Frank Turple were indicted. An investigation was underway by the U.S. Attorney's Office at that time to bring criminal indictments against Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, others who had been partners with Ed Wilson in the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company through which these activities had been carried out. For some reason, those investigations were stopped. In fact, Michael Ledeen went to Barcella and told him that he should avoid this investigation because he might be treading into areas of very sensitive national security information. In fact, another man by the name of Mark Richard and a man by the name of Ted Greenberg came and stopped the investigation. And thereafter, Theodore Shackley and Tom Kleins resigned from the Central Intelligence Agency. They were allowed to do so by the Deputy Director for Operations of the CIA at that time to avoid criminal indictment, and his name was Mr. Carlucci. Mr. Carlucci then went on to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and in 1982, when it was discovered that Richard Secord had been a partner of Ed Wilson, and Richard Secord was ordered to stand down from his command as the director of the Foreign Military Sales Program in the Middle East, pending an investigation and taking lie detector tests. An order came down from the Defense Department directing that he be reinstated without taking the lie detector test or submitting to the investigation. Soon thereafter, General Secord himself retired. The man who gave that order inside the Defense Department was Mr. Carlucci. Mr. Carlucci, as you know, has now been designated by President Reagan as the new National Security Advisor. And where did he get Mr. Carlucci? He got him from the Sears World Trade Center, where he worked at that time with Eric von Marbod and Howard Fish, both of whom were the supervisors of Richard Secord when he was engaged in the embezzlement program from the Foreign Military Sales Program in the Middle East. The likelihood of Mr. Baker to get to the bottom of this is very, very limited. I believe that what you see happening here is an attempted replay of the Gerald Ford decisions. To, in the midst of the beginning of a scandal like this, to reach out to a man who is popular with both parties in the Congress, who is trusted as an honest man of integrity from the Congress, to bring him in to the administration for damage control, when in fact George Bush is required to resign from the administration, which he indeed will be, as the developing facts evolve around Donald Gregg, his national security advisor, his relationship with Felix Rodriguez, and the arms shipments into Central America. I believe that you will see President Reagan move to appoint, under the new constitutional amendment, Mr. Baker Vice President of the United States. And when, in fact, the impeachment proceedings begin against the President of the United States, I believe that you will see Mr. Reagan resign for health purposes after he has established some sort of limited arms agreement with the Soviet Union. And he will retire for health reasons, and I believe that you will see Mr. Howard Baker become President of the United States and the incumbent candidate for the presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 1988. Things will move very, very swiftly. This House is a house of cards, and it will collapse very quickly. And I believe that is the scenario that we see with Mr. Baker.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
This tape just stopped. Who's...
What did Mr. Buckley, the hostage, say to his torturers in Iran that made our government so eager to ransom, to offer these ransoms?
We were aware of this information in December of last year, that I was contacted by a man who had interviewed Mr. Ghorbanifar and who had in fact obtained a copy for listening to of the tape-recorded negotiations of Ghorbanifar. Mr. Ghorbanifar tape-recorded all of his negotiations with the Iranians and with the Israelis and with the American side. And what this gentleman said after listening to the tapes, he said that, "I've got to tell you," he said, that in fact Mr. Buckley is the key to this. Mr. Buckley, while he was kidnapped in Beirut, was moved to Tehran and was tortured in Tehran on videotape. And he began to divulge the information which is in your affidavits in the Christic Institute case, he said. And when I went and confronted witnesses on this, I was given the following information: that Ed Wilson, in 1976 in Iran, was working under the direct supervision of Theodore Shackley and Tom Clines. Theodore Shackley at that time being the Assistant Deputy Director for Operations for the CIA under George Bush. Mr. Wilson's mission was to identify and to locate potential terrorists in Iran who were threats against the Shah and against members of the SAVAK, the secret political police for Iran. They were aware that somewhere people were being trained to come in and to attempt to eliminate some of these SAVAK leaders. Their intelligence data revealed to them that the training base at which these people were being trained was in Libya. There were in fact 5 training bases in Libya. Steps were taken at that time by Mr. Ed Wilson to establish communications with Muammar Gaddafi. Ed Wilson offered to sell very difficult to obtain time delay fuses for terrorist bombs to Gaddafi. This did not achieve his access to the information in those bases that he wanted, so he then began to offer C4 explosives to them. That did not succeed, and so he offered to them the services of the secret team, the assassination training capacity of Rafael Chichi Quintero, a man by the name of Rafael Villaverde and Raul Villaverde. They actually offered to carry out political assassinations under the direction of Muammar Gaddafi in order to establish the level of confidence they needed to obtain the information as to the locale of these training bases. They in fact succeeded in doing so. When they located the terrorist bases in Libya, they discovered that they were being trained there by the PLO. And Ed Wilson was able to obtain the information as to when a group that had been trained was going to be coming over into Iran. He could obtain the identity, the nationality of the false passports they were given, and the flight number on which they'd be leaving. And then he would turn this information over to the Savak, in fact, a particular safe house of Savak agents disguised as anti-Shah people, and they would assassinate these people. But in fact, they also discovered that the people being trained at those bases in Libya were not only going to Iran, but they were going to Nicaragua, and they were going to El Salvador, and they were going to the Philippines. This information was turned over to Shackley and Klein's, and they directed Mr. Wilson to communicate the passport, nationality, and flight numbers for these additional people, to give that information to Rafael Chichi Quintero, who at the time was based in the security division of the Mexican National Oil Company, Pemex, the president of whom at that time was Jorge Diaz Serrano, the former business partner of George Bush in Zapata Oil Company. And they would make decisions as to whether or not those groups were to be interdicted and assassinated. The man with whom Shackley and Klein's had to confer to obtain final permission was James Buckley. The information indicates, if this is true, that the information that would have been divulged by James Buckley under torture was not just the names of agents that we had in place, which all of us would be concerned about, but also the revelation of this private terrorist network that was operating under the supervision of Theodore Shackley and Tom Klein's and Albert Hakim and Richard Secord and Rafael Chichi Quintero. And the question remains as to what information did Vice President George Bush know about this terrorist network? And in fact, since he was the head of the Special Task Force on Counterterrorism, what is the relationship between this secret task force on anti-terrorism and this covert political assassination program that has now been exposed? That it would be our judgment in its preliminary form that he in fact did reveal the existence of this network, and this was in fact the reason for the delivery of the 40 tractor trailer loads of tow missiles and the Hawk missiles to the Iranians, which no one could understand. No one could believe they would do this unless there was some terrible dark secret for which we were being blackmailed. That ultimately is the price of this type of black conduct, that we are held up to not only to the scorn of the world, but we are subject to the blackmail of people who will ultimately undertake that conduct. Because what else, of course, is the seizure of the Kelly Laro? What else is the seizure of TWA airplanes with the threat of massively executing people but blackmail? And we have been blackmailed because we have been engaged in conduct of such a heinous nature that we could not tolerate that information being revealed to our American people. But this information will be revealed, and we will get to the bottom of this, because we all together believe that we can survive this scandal like any other in our political history, and we can be stronger and firmer and more effective in the world with the truth than with these lies.
Another question? Yes, in the back, way in the back. Would you speak up, please? I'm sorry.
I think NBC is here.
NBC is here, actually.
The-
This is a good question. The council does notify the media of all of our events. We don't know whether they come or not. But the question is, why is the media, if this is true, why are they not covering this aspect of the story if they are not?
It has indeed been one of the more puzzling aspects of this investigation. But It's understandable. Well, there's an old Judeo-Christian doctrine that to thoroughly understand is to forgive. But we cannot forgive a political structure like we would a person. We have to hold a political structure accountable. And what we have discovered is that in bringing the information up, you see that these men moved to these positions incrementally. They involved a lot of people who didn't share their objectives, but who came to discover that they were involved, and that the people who came to know about it and didn't do anything about it at an early enough stage now feel implicated. They feel that they somehow have failed us in their political and legal responsibilities, which indeed they have. And for that reason, there is an extraordinarily intense reluctance to now get into this information. And what we have discovered is that there are two factors, in our opinion, functioning with the national media on this. One is that if one is going to be making accusations, such as we have made in the federal civil lawsuit, a vast majority of which now, of course, have been demonstrated to be completely true, the media originally insisted that we have not just 2, but 3, 4, 5, 6 first-hand witnesses who could testify to their own personal knowledge that these things were true. Now, the fact of the matter is that people who are in possession of that type of information are obviously involved, and there was no immunity for these people. And we encountered that resistance on the part of the media to go to publish this. And what they encountered was that when they went to their normal sources, the Washington Post to the White House, the New York Times to the intelligence community, respectively, the people that used to share information with them had all of a sudden become Boy Scouts, as they told us, and would not talk about this information. When we gave information to Time Magazine, the writer of Time Magazine, the article, believed that it was true, had checked with his sources, had confirmed numerous aspects of this. But when it went to the board of editors, they were contacted by friends of Mr. Carlucci and friends of others who intensely insisted that they castigate the Christic Institute's case, that they denigrate those who are attempting to bring this information out. And indeed, because of the political relationships between certain members of the hierarchy in the media industry and their need to continue their relationship in levels of trust with administration and intelligence community officials, they declined to reveal this information. There is a second and somewhat more troublesome dimension. That is understandable in sort of a world. As I said, the more you understand, the more one might tend to forgive. But there is a more difficult area, and that is the one that we have come to know about growingly, and that is that unless the Democratic and Republican Party come to a sharp divergence on a matter of public policy, the major American media will not write about it because they don't really view it to be an issue. They look for the sparks and the smoke between the parties, and if in fact they go after an issue which is embarrassing to the national community and to the intelligence community or to our military or others, and they've not been given the sort of sanction or authorization by one of the major political parties to do this in an informal way, they begin to perceive themselves to be what they refer to as advocacy journalists. And they hate that. They can't stand being tagged with the character of being advocates against the administration or against the government itself. You see, and if you could go after one administration, or you can go after even one party, but to go after something that both parties tend to be supporting is viewed as somehow unpatriotic, causing trouble, sort of a leftist kind of thing to do. And that is the thing that we have perceived here. Because at the beginning of this crisis, as you recall, even people like Chris Dodd from Connecticut would come on to the national television shows and say, well, we all think something ought to be done about this administration in Nicaragua. We all ought to do something to stop them. Nobody supports socialism or communism in our hemisphere, but we just disagree with the particulars of the Contras. We don't think the Contras are the best way to go about doing this. So you didn't get a really dramatic denunciation on the part of the Democratic leadership of the general activities. You can't convince anyone, I think, that the Democratic Party didn't know about masses of millions of dollars going into Central America. You know, the major big pine exercises that the U.S. military was engaged in once every spring, they would go down and build huge air bases like at Aguacate and then turn them over to the Contras. And so that the media, in our judgment, had a very difficult time understanding what the issue was here that was proper for them to talk about, in the same way that they knew all about the plans to invade at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and did nothing about it. Same way that some of them knew about the Grenada thing being planned and did nothing about it. They do not want to get themselves into a position where they view themselves as adversaries to the national interest. And that is a very difficult issue, and it's one that, again, while one can understand it, one sure wishes that they would play out their role as the Fourth Estate and be a bit more inquisitive and a bit more intense about ascertaining the truth behind these things, and that groups such as the Christic Institute, with support of people such as yourself around the country, didn't have to constantly be undertaking these types of investigations and revelations.
Thank you. That is all the time we have. Ladies and gentlemen,